It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
My guest is John Seiler. He's a professor and a tree physiology specialist. So we're going to talk about environmental stress effects on especially woody plants, including water and pollutant stresses and the physiological responses that plants have. So I think this will be a great call. So welcome, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me and having an interest in trees and forests.
Yeah, I'm really interested in them. There's a tree near a store that I go to, and I've been taking pictures of it, like every couple of weeks to just see how it changes over the year. So I'm going to see what interesting things I notice, just by taking pictures of it. I figure why not, see what happens to it as it goes bare and it, gets leaves and et cetera.
You're right, Leo. That's it. A lot of times chronosequence photos like that will show you things you never notice otherwise.
Yeah. But, to begin with, tell me about your background. Like what got you into studying what you study?
Yeah, well, I've been doing this for well over 40 years. I originally grew up in Pittsburgh, in a really dense neighborhood. And a lot of people always wonder, like, how did you ever get involved in the natural world and working in forests when you grew up in Pittsburgh? And, as a kid, where there's no media and things like that, no phones, anything like that. We just were always out playing in what we called woods. And all they were little strips between houses, But we thought we were out in the big forests and all, and playing in creeks and damming them up and things like that. And we used to vacation in Canada every summer. And even back then, I would wonder why the forest changed so much from Western PA to Ontario. I don't think I was a geek as a kid or anything, but I would just be puzzled how the forest was so different up there than it was in Pittsburgh.
Maybe you weren't seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and then a friend of mine, a buddy of mine back then, he had Ranger Rick Nature magazine, no kidding, and he would give me his old ones. And then on top of that, the environmental movement started, and I just was sort of hitting my teenage years. And that kind of swept me up into thinking about the environment. And back then, if you wanted to become like an environmental scientist, the forestry was pretty much the field you went into. We like to say we're the original environmentalists because there was no like environmental management or environmental science degrees back when I was in college. So I picked up forestry and been doing it ever since.
Okay. So what, in your current position, what are you researching, studying, or, looking at in the, as you're out and about?
Yeah, well, my research, I guess I could summarize in a quick way. I kind of chase carbon dioxide molecules around. As the trees suck them up from the air, I measure photosynthesis, and then some of that is moved below ground. Some of it's stored in the trunk, and I actually will measure how much carbon dioxide comes back out of the soil. Like a lot of people don't realize, the soil is really, really active, and it's basically breathing. And And tree roots are like us. They've got to get their food from the top of the tree. And so they're underneath there respiring. So a lot of CO2 is gushing back out of the soil. And so, you might remember it from school possibly, or some of your listeners, you may have memorized some cycle, like the carbon cycle as an example. Mm-hmm. Cycle. Yeah, and there, you crammed it in your head, bunch of boxes, a bunch of arrows, right? Well, what I do is give people numbers for some of the boxes of the carbon cycle and some of the arrows, which is your fluxes, your exchange from one box to the other. So I'll go out and be on the ground measuring numbers like that. And
interesting.
For that, go ahead.
So what kind of interesting numbers or things have you discovered by doing that?
Well, one is like just the amount of carbon dioxide that comes back out of the ground. It's a large number. But then on top of that, there's a big hole under the ground too, way more than a lot of people realize. The soil contains a huge amount of carbon that's trapped out of the atmosphere. And it's of keen interest to lots of people. When different disturbances take place, you can perturb that. And one of your arrows, the one coming out of the ground, can increase tremendously, and we can lose that trapped carbon below ground without a fire or anything. Just stirring up the soil like that can release carbon dioxide.
Oh, so what happens when traditional farming, they tear up the field at the end of the season, they till it? Like, does that create a massive release of carbon, or what's happening?
Yeah, well, that is a really good question and an important one. And the short answer to that is yes. In intense agriculture where there's a lot of tillage, it's actually very hard to keep your carbon content up in the soil. And a real, you always see these pictures of people with hands holding really, really rich soil with a little seed there. Yeah. A lot of you may have noticed, a lot of our soil doesn't look like that. And that's a really rich carbon soil, with a lot of peat-like products in it. And agricultural soil, when you do the tilling like that, you're burning that off. And so, there's a lot of interest in tilling back crop residues and things like that. And
there's no-till regenerative farming from what I've heard, yeah.
Exactly, because early on, every nation has gone through cycles where they've just basically burned out their soils. We're no different in the United States. It's only since about the Civil War where all the land-grant colleges started with agriculture programs where we started figuring out how to do this sustainably. And a lot of soil was kind of ruined and burned off, not just from losing it from tillage, but also erosion is a really, really big thing. A large part of the eastern United States, the Piedmont, for example, it's a large swath running from Virginia all the way down through all the southeastern states, has huge amount of erosion that it's gone. Like in some places over a foot of the soil. You may know, like in Georgia, that they're famous for the red clays. As you're driving down there, that when they freshly tilled it, it's very red. That's because you're not looking at the old topsoil; it's gone, and you're looking at a lower, what we call a soil horizon that once was buried 8 to 12 inches deeper. To take it back to tree, that's one thing that I've learned and was surprising to me as a new student in forestry. Trees can grow back on that stuff when crops have begun to fail. They're just amazing organisms for coming back into some seriously compromised land, like serious surface mining and things like that. Trees will grow where you have a hard time getting anything else growing.
Why and how? Is it because their root systems are able to crack through rocks or break through tough soil?
No, what it is they just don't require the levels of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, kind of your major ones. They don't have the requirements that our crops do. And so the soil is kind of lost for crop production, but trees are kind of like, we're ready to go. And then they do a great job of restoring those areas. I mentioned how the erosion on the Piedmont of the southeastern U.S., there's places now you can go back where there's forests there, and people will think like, oh, this has just been here forever, when, actually like 100 years ago, it was cotton or soybean or in large places tobacco. And then it just got to where you couldn't support yourself doing that anymore, and people just moved on. And then trees came back all on their own.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're pretty tough organisms.
Can you give some numbers? You said there's a certain amount of carbon trapped in the soil. a certain amount of oxygen taken, carbon put out, et cetera. By modeling all these systems, I know every system's different, but do you have any, any numbers or relative scales on how much carbon is sequestered in soil, how much this, how much that?
Yeah. Well, probably the most useful thing, like you can always get these numbers about, gigatons and all that stuff. But maybe more useful is if you take a forest and what you see, you see these tree trunks, right? And the top of the tree and the branches and the big canopy. And that's certainly a lot of carbon, right? Half of it, of the whole forest ecosystem, roughly about half of the carbon is below ground that you don't even see. And it's not just roots. In fact, the soil has probably the majority of it. Even though it's low amounts, there's just a lot of soil there. So like a forest soil might have only 2% carbon, and a lot of times less than that. That's really a low number, right? But there's so much when you add it up. There's lots of these gigatons below there.
Well, why do you think it works that way? What's the benefit of having carbon in significant amounts in the soil? Is it to acidify it so that bacteria can take advantage of it, or like in what form is it in? Carbon? Is it carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide? What is it?
It's all sorts of chemical compounds, but it's bound onto the soil's basically decomposed rock. That's what we call the mineral soil fraction, right? That's the kind of stuff when you pick up soil and you kind of scrape it between your fingers, and you can kind of even hear it if you put it close to your ears, like a little bit of sand or something. That's your mineral soil fraction. The carbon's all bound up on that, which basically stains a lot of the minerals brown. So your soil will start looking brown. So there's all kind of complex carbon molecules that are below there, as well as very, very small plant parts. So it's a whole spectrum of carbon compounds there. And some of it is in the liquid state. If soil's soaking in if water's soaking in soil a long time, you'll see that water turning brown, and that's some carbon compounds washing off and going into the soil. Like blackwater swamps in the southeast, that's all carbon flowing out in the water that came and washed out through the forest system.
But again, does anyone know the use of the carbon in the soil, or uses?
Well, it's very, very important for binding nutrients. The mineral fraction will do that some, but your carbon compounds can be sites where your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium and others nutrients get bound up on. And then when tree roots and water in the soil system come in contact, they'll go into solution into the water, and then tree roots can begin to take up the compounds. So as they break down over time, they're releasing the nutrients back to the tree. So that in itself is a cycle. Like the leaves are on the tree, they fall off in the fall, they decompose. Otherwise, we'd have hundreds of feet of tree leaves, right? We don't. And that they slowly break down. And as that breaks down, all the nutrients are released again, and the trees are able to take it up again. Yeah, so they're basically a source of nutrients, and the other thing is it greatly increases water holding capacity of the soil.
Why does carbon do that?
Well, think of sand. Okay, so that's got very, very little carbon in it, literally like beach sand, right? Your water just moves right through there. Well, if you took one part sand and then mixed in another part of peat you bought, a bale of peat, right, and you mix that up, you'd start getting a spongy material. And so that peat, just its physical nature, holds water like a sponge. And so the more carbon material below ground, your water's just held on to it. If you take peat and just soak it in water, you can just squeeze the water out of it between your hands. So that's kind of what's basically going on.
Okay, so it helps to retain water. Okay, so it does a lot, yeah.
Yeah, source of nutrients. And helps hold water.
What about temperature or pH control? What do you think the role of carbon is there?
With the temperature, say that again. I missed.
Oh, the soil temperature and pH control.
Well, carbon compounds basically are acidic. In forest soils versus some agriculture soils, forest soils are known as being very acid, but trees are adapted to grow in that. So that's okay. So a lot of these carbon compounds, like again, I use just tannic acid as one example. Well, it's acidic. It's an acid. So it's going to lower the pH of the soil, and forest soils are well known for being more acidic. Depending, like if you just cut down a forest, depending on the crop, you may have to add a lot of limestone, which would raise the pH. There might be some that can grow in that acidic condition, but initially they may not do real well.
Okay. So your current work is just to understand these cycles and the amounts of materials that are flowing and their roles, or, what are some of the practical applications of what you learned?
Yeah. What people do with these numbers, I don't do it. I'll give them these numbers. They'll put them into what are called process models, where you have a rate of photosynthesis and you have a rate of respiration, and the models will basically grow a tree. Okay, so you put processes in there, and what you can do with that is, if then say water stress is going to lower photosynthesis, say 20%, you can tweak the model and see what impact that's going to do on your tree growth without having to wait around. Okay, so that's sort of a practical application of basic research. Now, some things that I do are almost more directly applied. I don't just only chase carbon molecules around. Like, I've got some research where we're looking at the effect of fire on tree seedling regeneration. There's a lot of forests that need fires to stay healthy. That's sort of a misconception we're still kind of battling with the public. Smokey Bear was so successful, decades, in convincing all of us that fire is bad, that we've kind of messed up a lot of forest ecosystems. Like, they need to be burned, and we're getting a handle on it.
And why? Tell me about what burning does and how it helps.
Oh, yeah, boy, it's fascinating. There's a lot. Well, here's one that's really kind of cool. There's some tree species, that conifers, that their pine cones won't even open up unless they're burned and heated. And so when you don't have a fire, one here in the east is Table Mountain pine. And like the name, it kind of grows in the mountains. And it's not endangered or threatened, but it's a lot rarer than it used to be, because it only lives for like 80 to 100 years. Well, in the past, we would have fires that would come through on cycles way earlier than that. Like within 40 years, we'd have a pretty intense fire. And that would kill the trees, but the pine cones that are up in the top of the tree open in the heat. Their seeds come down. Well, in the absence of fire, none of the cones open, and the trees just basically die of old age. And your oaks and hickories live centuries in comparison to these Table Mountain pines, and the forests are just changing into oak and longer-lived hardwood trees. So they're now getting on top of this and going out and doing what's called prescribed fires. Like a doctor gives a prescription, they're writing a prescription for that forest and saying, we need to burn this. And then we're getting our Table Mountain pine back. Another good example of this is something that's called the mesification of the forest. Mesic is meaning moist. So it's like the moistening of the forest. Tree species that weren't in great abundance, like red maple, in absence of fire, red maple has been largely taking over the eastern forest. It is the number one most abundant tree by stem counts in the state of Virginia, red maple. A lot of listeners may be familiar with that tree because it's used in urban areas and for ornamental planting. And fires would kill red maple and kind of keep it back in swampier areas. And it's now spread into drier and drier areas because we've been running out there and putting fires out. And so it would get killed by fires very easily because it has a very, very thin bark. And then other species that have thicker bark would survive. And so now it's out there because of no fires, out competing what would naturally be there. Before, we were messing around putting these fires out. Now, not to say we should let every fire burn. There's specific rules that are followed for this, but we're starting to understand better the role of fire in natural forest ecosystems. Some of the western fires are at such intensity because of all the down and dead fuel that's all over the ground, because we haven't had fires frequently enough. And it's just built up to catastrophic levels.
So what happens when you don't have a fire? Like, is there a lot of underbrush or crowding of material, and do things dry out and then lead to a fire anyway? Like, what happens when you don't?
Yeah,
the place doesn't burn.
Yeah, all of the above. Okay, so you're not, let's say an area naturally burns on a cycle of like every 20 years. Well, you're only going to build up so much brush, as branches die on the tree and fall to the ground. That if you don't have any fires, sure, they decompose, but that's a really, really slow process. And so you can build up very, very heavy fuel levels, as they call it. And then you're eventually going to have a fire, right? These places have droughts and it gets hot. Insects come in and kill trees. It's just part of the natural process. But with the heavy fuel that's built up, they become catastrophic, where they'd be much lower intensity if they were coming at more frequent periods of time.
Yeah. How do you know in a particular biome how often it should burn, how intensely it should burn? How could anyone know that?
There's ways to go back in time, but looking at fire scars, looking at the soil again and finding how many layers of charcoal you can find, that you can look in lake sediments and find out frequency of burns, because charcoal settles in the lake and soot, and it sinks and it leaves kind of like tree rings in the sediment of the soil in the bottom of lakes. And so other ecologists who study these things can say, hey, in the past, this seems to have burned every 10 to 15 years. There's even simple things like in the past, there's stories of being able to like ride a wagon through the forests of the eastern U.S. or ride a horseback. You try that in some of the forests now, you're going to get yanked off by your hair. So, simple things like that. The understory was more naturally cleared out just because of the frequency of these fires. And then on top of that, there's trees that have these really specific adaptations that without a fire, their pine cones won't open. And they're found all around the world. There's the Table Mountain pine I mentioned in the east. There's jack pine in the lake states in southern Ontario, Canada. And out west, there's lodgepole pine, millions of acres that needed to burn more frequently. And then they didn't. And we're trying to catch up, and hopefully we're doing a good job. It's kind of an interesting thing. There's so many stories of, hey, we think this is a good idea, and then we realize, oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We realize, wait a minute, nature knows what it's doing. How could this be,
Yeah, like, boy, we need to do this for these trees. Well, meanwhile, they were there a lot longer than Europeans have been here mucking in the forest. Yeah.
So what happens? Are there any examples of a forest where the underbrush has been cleared, but it hasn't burned? What happens then? If you don't have these trees where the pine cones need to be heated, let's say you're in a forest where you don't have those kind of trees. And again, whoever owns that parcel has been really diligent about clearing the underbrush. And so it hasn't burned. And instead of every 10 years, now it's been 20 years. Like what would be observed?
Well, the main thing, if it is a place that burns, like not like, Let's rule out wetlands, okay? They wouldn't. Right. But what the main thing that would go on there would be large amounts of down and dead fuel building up on the forest floor. And then...
So what if you cleared it away? What if you were really diligent and you liked a nice...
Hey, that's a great question there, or observation, because there's one practice that we do instead of prescribed burning is they're running huge equipment through there, like giant brush clearers that are masticating this material, just chopping it up. It's just grinding through the forest. They're doing that to bust down the dead fuel. And when it's busted up like that and it's on the forest floor where it's moist, it decomposes really, really fast. And so that's actually one technique that on a large scale, like and a homeowner, like at a smaller scale, if you did what you described, kept it all very, very clear, you'd be keeping your home safe from having a fire coming up. So you can literally do it on a small scale.
But is there any downside to doing that? Do places just need to burn maybe for other reasons that we've either discovered or not discovered?
Well, the ones we've discovered, let's just say there's a whole lot. I'd say there's more that have needed to burn than not. And basically whole scale, we were putting all forest fires out. Another really good one that people wouldn't really think about this, like out in where the sequoias grow in the Sierra Nevadas, they have extremely thick bark, like 12 inches thick, the bark. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Okay. So they are very, very fire resistant, but fir trees and some pine trees are not. Sequoia is another ecosystem that needs to burn. Well, 50 years of putting fire out allowed fir trees, which are thin barked, to get tall enough to where the crowns of the fir trees are now reaching up into the bottom limbs of the sequoias. Make sense? Then when you have a fire, the fire's high enough in the fir trees to scorch the sequoia foliage, where it never would have been. Because we'd have a fire like 30, 40 years and the thin bark firs, and it was just how they grew. They had a shorter life, It wasn't knocked on them. They weren't meant to be, their crowns kind of lapping up and intersecting with the sequoia crowns. And then when you'd have these fires, the sequoias would be fire scarred maybe, but not killed because the bark's a foot thick. And if you ever pick up a piece of sequoia bark, I have a chunk that I pass around in a class that I teach. It's basically got the density of styrofoam. It's a unbelievable insulator. So the trees aren't killed by the fire. But if the fire gets up into the crown of the needles, there's no fire resistance. And so we've really messed up the sequoia ecosystems as well. But they're on top of that too now. And we're running fires through there to kill the competition off.
So where is there an example of a forest that, maybe a large scale one that's really taken care of well, and what's happening with it? What's being noticed?
Wow, that's a tough question. Because
there is one.
Yeah, there's so much manipulation, even in the Amazon, right? I think a lot of the national forest system, we're getting back on top of it as we understand more and more. But a lot of it has been set back. Yeah.
Okay. We don't have very good examples yet. Interesting.
Yeah.
Are there, after a fire, have you gone out to sites to take samples and observe what's going on after a recent fire? Like mushrooms growing and
that's
cool
that's one
that
thing.
Maybe not being noticed.
So I was talking about an applied research. What this graduate student did was that's exactly what he did. The Forest Service here in the area has been doing these prescribed fires, and he then went out and examined the areas afterwards to see if we've improved oak seedling regeneration versus red maple seedling regeneration. And that's in fact exactly what he found. In the burned areas, the red maple seedlings, the numbers are way, way down, and oak regeneration has increased. That's an intense area of research right now. Oaks are considered very high quality forest, and naturally there was a lot of good oak timber in the area. And as we've gone through doing all this extraction and on top of that, then no burning, we were not getting back the oak timber that was once present. So now we're beginning to think that the fire was a part of that. It's back to, red maple taking over the eastern forest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anyone tried to do a tree farm of sequoias? Like, can you grow them fast enough where you, let's say, strip off the bark and make like a living insulation, for homes, or a natural fire barrier that maybe could be put up in a forest to contain a fire or do controlled burns?
Well,
is that possible?
Yeah. Now, I'm not aware of anybody doing that, but that's an interesting, there's others, like waste from coconuts are used for insulation and batting. They're thinking of looking at examining hemp. That's a possibility of, so they grow very, very fast. Sequoias do. And so it's potentially there. I couldn't point to a specific study where I know of anybody like looking at that bark and then shredding it, but that could be a very good sustainable biomaterial insulator.
Yeah.
I see the potential for sure. We have a biomaterials department here, and I'll have to bring that up with some of my colleagues. A biomaterial, the department's called Sustainable Biomaterials, and I always kind of joke with people, that's basically wood. Wood is a tremendously good biomaterial. amazing, actually.
Another thing I saw, this is just growing like row crops, but this one lady I saw that she, in between planting, she would take a flamethrower and like just scorch the soil for a second. And she said it prevented weeds from growing, but it allowed, her crops to grow. Is there a, instead of a controlled burn, is there a way to do like a temporary, a scorching of an area of forest so that it's naturally resistant to fire, or maybe it gets enough heat for, the proper things to happen as if there was a fire? Can you emulate a fire in a place?
Yeah, well, you definitely have the right idea there. But given the thousands, tens of thousands, millions of acres of managed forest, what they do is run these prescribed fires in the understory. Like, for example, loblolly pine plantations. Loblolly pine is probably the most intensively studied tree species in the world. You could make an argument for that. We really know how to grow it. A lot of paper products, forest industry in the southeastern U.S. depends on loblolly pine. And that's one of these forests that you see them growing in straight rows. It's like agriculture. Well, it is agriculture. It just takes 15 to 20 years instead of 1 year for corn, right? What they do there is they run low-intensity prescribed fires in the understory of these loblolly pines and do just what you're just talking about there. It kills all the understory, the competition of the tree against the tree. They're taking up water and nutrients. They burn underneath, and that keeps the forest cleared.
Okay.
So they're doing a scorching, but they still do it with a fire. And it's the kind of fire, like, because they're doing it frequently, you can almost jump over it, right? It's moving very slowly in the pine needles of the forest.
So the forest fires, do people know the temperature range of them? Do certain forests burn a lot harder than others? If like there's a lot of underbrush, how does it change the dynamics of a fire versus there's not too much underbrush, but you had an unlucky season, it was really dry, the fire, the forest burned before it normally would. Again, any of the fire science there you could talk about.
Yeah, basically it comes down to the amount of fuel. Like, we know like how much energy is going to come out of wood, and and wood is wood. So it depends on how much down, dry, woody material you've got. And that's, you can see like two size campfires, right? One with 1 pound of wood and one with 10 pounds of wood. I mean, you know what you're going to see there. You're going to have a much bigger fire in the one. The amount of BTUs coming out of the wood, it's the same. But per pound, you got 10 pounds versus 1 pound. So the amount of fuel that's there is going to be a really, really big factor. But there is one other thing. Pine needles, there are some tree species that have, and other plants as well, that have very, very flammable foliage. Even when green, and it can be due to compounds on the leaf surface, like very simply wax. There can be a lot of wax on leaf surfaces. There's one here in the eastern forest called mountain laurel. A lot of people would be familiar with that. It's used a little bit as an ornamental as well. But even when green, that thing has so much wax on its leaf surface. And the wax is there so it doesn't lose water. So, I mean, the plant knows what it's doing. But when that lights up, it becomes very, very dangerous. And then a lot of pine needles, in general, conifers, the gymnosperms, they'll burn hotter because a lot of volatile compounds, like oils are coming out, and other hydrocarbons, and those things are very, very flammable. So the amount of fuel and then the foliage will interact. This is why when you see these what are called big crown fires, the kind that you'll see on the news at night, where they're up in the tops of the trees, those are almost always in conifer forests, because the fire can leap up to those even when it's green needles. There's so much flammable material in them that they'll burn even with the water that's in there.
Huh.
Yeah, and it can.
What about temperature? Fires again in different forest conditions. What has been observed?
Yeah, the temperature is again going to just depend on the amount of.
What about the nature of it? Like maybe maples burn more vigorously than ash, and they burn at a hotter temperature. I don't know.
Yeah, it would probably break down more on the lines of hardwoods versus conifers. The conifers with your volatile compounds would be the one that would start burning more intensely. No, I'm no expert in this, but there's clearly a breakdown between hardwoods and conifers, your needle trees, and they're going to be be hotter than the broadleaf trees would be. I think a general pattern would be the amount of wax that the tree would have on its leaves could lead to higher temperatures.
Okay, but no one's studied this or taken temperature readings or anything in the middle of fire.
They may have, but it's not an area I do research in. I've gone into past burned areas looking at the forest composition afterwards, but haven't been involved in the actual burning of the forest. Someone else would be involved in that. Well, our faculty here, we actually have a fire ecologist here.
I was going to joke and say you've been burned before, so you don't know.
Yeah, stay away from it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's a whole field in itself, and they certainly go out and they're out lighting fires, and they put all kind of temperature instrumentation out there. And here's just one interesting observation: just the length of the flame that you see. Let's say 12 inches of flame on the forest floor versus 10 feet of flame as it's burned through the brush. That's highly correlated with the temperature. So many times what they'll do is observe flame length and be recording that.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
there's a lot to it. Huh. So what are some research questions that you're trying to answer at this time right now?
There probably couple applied things. One, the effect we've talked about, the effect of burning on the on seedling regeneration. Another one, we're looking at a forestry practice called crop tree release, and that's a very, very intuitive thing for landowners. You're basically walking in the forest and picking out good-looking trees and then cutting weedy ones around them. It's very, very intuitive, and so a lot of people can kind of do that themselves versus some other forestry practices are kind of hard to do. And myself and some colleagues have been developing a kind of do-it-yourself crop tree release online program. And so they can get on there and watch videos and then go and try to do it themselves. And in fact, this summer, we have volunteer landowners doing that. And we're actually going to score them. We're going to visit their land and see how they did. I'm not sure how landowners are going to take it when we tell them they failed. I'm hoping everybody gets A's and B's when we go grade their success in doing it. So that's extremely applied. That's going straight to people that own forest and seeing how they do. A more basic one that goes back to photosynthesis and physiology. We're examining how temperature is influencing photosynthetic rates. When we're concerned about rising temperatures, well, trees are able to acclimate to that. Well, just like us, we get a first warm day like in March, and everybody's running around with shorts on, and then thinking like, wow, it's so nice, and then you get your first cold day, and it's really only 60, and people are like getting their jacket out, So we get through. We acclimate. Well, trees do the same thing, and so I've got a project where we're looking at red spruce and its ability to acclimate to temperature. This is really a neat thing. Red spruce in the southern Appalachians are what is called a relic species. When the last glaciers were here, coming halfway down through Pennsylvania, the boreal forest that you see up in Canada was actually down here in Virginia and North Carolina. And as glaciers retreated, red spruce trees kind of moved up the mountainsides where it kept staying cold enough for them. Yeah. And they're now stuck like little island nations on only the highest peaks of the southern Appalachians. I've got red spruce trees growing from different elevations, and I'm looking to see if they're adapted already to higher temperatures. Like red spruce trees that are at a relatively lower position, are they more adapted to a warmer temperature already because the selection pressure has been high enough to select for that. And then I have populations from higher elevation, and are they going to be more used to colder temperatures because they haven't had the warmth yet? And then I'm growing both of them in a high temperature and a low temperature and seeing how they adapt to the temperatures just like we do as the seasons change. So if they're able to really adapt, a couple degrees of warming may not be a problem because they can adapt to that. We may find they don't change at all. And then like, aha, that's a different problem. Or
Yeah, very interesting.
yeah, right. So we're just getting that started right now. We're actually have constructed the chambers in the greenhouse, and we have a cold one and a hot one. And we're going to be going in there and measuring photosynthesis and root growth and how, their sizes, how well they do in the different environments. So we're kind of simulating the environment. It's not outdoors. It's very controlled.
Okay. Is anyone looking at the, the microbial attachment, to the roots of some of these trees? I guess maybe unlike other plants, or maybe not. Does anyone go and dig down near the, near the base of a tree, near the trunk, and look at the microbial activity underneath and see how that changes before and after a fire, or when other trees take prominence, or just at different points in the life cycle of the forest?
Oh, no, absolutely. There's people doing that. We're not doing that in this situation, but all trees, it's the rule, not the exception. They all have mycorrhizal networks, very, very intense mycorrhizal networks that go for acres and acres. In fact, there was a study once up in the Pacific Northwest where they were making the claim that this mycorrhizal organism was the largest organism on the planet because it was one genetic organism, and it went for acres.
The one in Oregon?
I think so. Don't hold me to that. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when they sampled it, they were all genetically identical, and so it's one organism all throughout the root system. And even though it doesn't weigh much when it's that expansive, again, kind of gets back to our carbon content in the soil. There may not be a lot, but there's so much. And millions of acres of this, they were saying it's the largest organism. So yeah, as pHs change, mycorrhiza change. Different tree species definitely have different species and types of mycorrhizal organisms, but they all have it for sure. It's a rule, not an exception at all.
Okay. Well, very good. So what's the best way for interested folks to learn more about what you're working on? Where can they go?
Well, I'll tell you, it really doesn't take them to my research program, but I do have an online presence, and I answer tree questions every day to dozens and dozens of people. If they were to just Google Dr. Dendro, they're even able to submit a question directly to me. And so that can be done on the internet, and that can also be done through an app called VTree. That's a tree identification app that we've developed here, and I'll let people know it's free.
Cool.
And yeah, one of the classes I teach is tree identification. It's actually known as the hardest one-credit class at the university. It's kind of a love-hate kind of thing. They do love it, but it's very, very hard for them. And so we have a.
I gotta ask you something. It's a silly question, probably, but what's the point of bark?
Oh no, that's not a question. That
probably does many things, but
that's a really, really great question. In fact, let me just expand it a little bit. Like one misconception people have about trees. Let's just get a picture in your head of like a 20-inch diameter oak tree. Well, what's really fascinating is the vast majority of what you're looking at, especially in the wintertime when the leaves aren't there. So let's just say it's wintertime. The absolute vast majority is all dead. All the wood that's there is dead. There is a 4-inch zone on the outside of the tree that is the only living material. And as you let's say, like cutting down a tree, as you exit that first 1/4 inch, that's all dead wood. That
the interior, you mean the exterior part?
The what?
The exterior part, you mean like the exterior 1/4 inch is all dead?
No, that's the only living thing, the outer 1/4 inch ring. Okay? And that gets back to the bark question. Bark is protecting that. So when you knock off the bark, you hit a moist material, and that's called the phloem, sometimes called the inner bark. Get it? Inner, okay, versus outer bark is dead. That inner bark, the phloem, that sometimes can be eaten as a survival food. Why? Because that's what's moving sugars around. And there's
the xylem and phloem went through the whole circumference of the tree.
Okay, so there you go. So the phloems, from the inside of the phloem, there's something called the vascular cambium, and that's literally like one cell thick. That thing produces everything you see about that tree. A new ring every year as it gets fatter and fatter and fatter. The bark's protecting that because it's right there on the outside. And so you hit the trunk of the tree, the bark has saved the phloem and the cambium. You knock off the bark in the tree, like people take a weed eater to a tree thinking, oh, it's just dead bark. If you do that all the way around, you've killed the tree. So bark's protecting the phloem and the vascular cambium, which the cambium is responsible for new phloem and new xylem, which is why the tree gets bigger in diameter. The second thing goes back to fire. Fire resistance of a tree. When we say like, oh, red maple's not fire resistant. If we would just have fire, we'd kill the red maples and get rid of our problem with all the red maple. Fire resistance in a tree is almost solely due to bark thickness. When there's a tree that's resistant to resistant to fire, it's got thick bark. A tree that's not resistant has thin bark, and it's pretty much simply that. So sequoia, 12-inch thick bark, probably one of the most fire-resistant trees in the world. Red maple has maybe a 1/4-inch bark, very, very susceptible. And that gets back to, do you cook the phloem? You can have a long fire when you have 1 foot of insulation. The heat simply never gets through to the phloem. You got a really, really thin layer. It takes like 5 minutes of a flame. You've baked the phloem and you've killed the tree. Phloem's what's moving sugars all up and down the tree. You may have learned in school that it only moves down. That's not really true. It can move up too, but a lot moves down because it's supplying sugars to the root system, which can't make its own.
So the whole interior of a lot of trees is dead?
Of all trees is dead. There's some living ray cells, but we're talking upwards of over 90%. It's all dead xylem. Now, that's not saying it's not important. The xylem are dead, basically wooden straws, very, very tiny little straws bundled up, right? Millions of bundled up, and they're moving water. But their functioning xylem is dead. They're hollow straws so the water can move freely through the open tubes. I mean, picture water trying to move through cytoplasm, the kind of the gooey ick inside a cell.
Yeah.
Like put egg yolk all up in your straw and try to suck up your milkshake. Not very efficient. So efficient, functioning, mature xylem is dead and hollowed out. It has very, very thick.
Weird.
That's wood. That's your biomaterial. It makes great.
So a tree is like the living part of the tree is like a skin over a core of mostly inactive, but I guess water-carrying material, like a scaffold. I guess it's a scaffolding, it's water-carrying, it's insulation in a way. It still can be a lot of things, even if it's not very biologically active.
Yeah, well, it's active in taking water up, absolutely. And more there, okay? Only about the outer inch of xylem is active in taking up water. That's called the sapwood. That's the only thing that's wet. The rest of the tree is heartwood, and that's not active in taking water up. But that doesn't mean it's not important, because that's the big, huge stick that's holding the crown of the tree up in the air so it stays in the sunlight. So wood makes a great pole. Okay, we figured that out pretty quick because that's what it's doing for the tree. Like big trees, I always tell my students this, they're basically shrubs on a stick. The top of the crown of the tree is the shrub, and there's a stick that goes up every year, pushing the shrub up to stay in the light. The one that doesn't stay in the light, well, that's the death process started. Little less.
Well, like so if I'm looking at a tree right now, I'm looking outside.
Yeah.
So is there a difference of the depth of the heartwood in the lower trunk versus the branches? Like from what I could see, you'd have a higher surface area to volume ratio of the thinner branches of the living component and less so on the trunk. But is the thickness of the living part thicker on the bottom or thicker in the branches?
Okay. As a proportion, no. Absolute, yes. Okay, so when you've got a 1-inch branch, you're going to have a much narrower little band of phloem and a much narrower band of sapwood. But as a proportion, no. Now, when it gets really, really, really big, that proportion will start going, proportionally, it will start going down again because a lot of trees have a set amount of sapwood. So when you only have an inch of sapwood at a maximum, once it comes to an inch, as that tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger in diameter as a proportion, that's still going down.
Yeah.
There's more and more and more and more what's called heartwood, which is not moving up water. Trees.
So they're weird. So is there capillary action? Like is the area of living wood so thin in certain parts that you get like capillary action and other processes to bring nutrients up higher than they otherwise could because of the influence of gravity?
Boy, this is fun, but this maybe be another podcast.
Oh, okay.
How trees take up water is absolutely almost miraculous. Okay, it's not capillary action. It's sucked up basically through the xylem, as water really likes to stick together with itself. Okay, it's very cohesive because of what's called hydrogen bonds. So water molecules cling together. Okay, now up in the top of the tree, as one water molecule evaporates out of the leaf, because the water likes to cling to each other, as one evaporates, it drags another water molecule forward. And then when that one leaves, it drags another one. And then that one's dragged forward, it drags the next one up, and so on down the chain. So when water starts leaving the top of the tree, when the sun comes up in the morning, it doesn't start moving down in the root system for sometimes like an hour later, because it takes that long for that chain to transmit the signal down. So it's pulled up to the top of the tree. And thankfully, water is very cohesive, so that chain of water molecules doesn't snap.
Huh.
Yeah.
So as the sun comes out, that activates slowly the water to be pulled up through the roots and through the whole body of the tree during the day?
Yep. Okay, so as the sun comes up, the pores in the leaves, which are called stomata, they open when the sun comes up. They open in the light. When they open, water molecules start evaporating. They just don't have any choice. The leaf is wet. But they have to open to get carbon dioxide in. So we're back to carbon dioxide. So they open up so they get carbon to come in so they can make sugar. And they open up, water starts leaving through evaporation. And as one leaves, it drags the next one up and the next one up and the next one up, so on down the chain until down at the very, very fine root tip, it drags another one in through the soil and the tree stays hydrated. At night, the opposite occurs. The stomata close in the dark. Now, not in all plants, but trees, they do. Okay, they close in the dark, and then the water stops immediately at the top of the tree, but it could be an hour later down in the root system before it stops moving. There's quite a lag. It's kind of similar like when you're in traffic at a red light, green light, and the light turns green and the cars start moving at the green light, and you're way back and you don't move for like 3 minutes.
Like getting it off an airplane or something.
It's exactly the same thing. And the water molecule, it's like you're kind of holding hands with the person in front of you. The holding hands is the hydrogen bond between the water molecules. Here's a fascinating thing. A way to break the hydrogen bonds is add soap to the water.
Okay.
If you make a tree take up soapy water, the whole system collapses.
Right.
The water molecules all break apart. Yeah, so it's a test of it. You break the cohesiveness, and they can't take water up. So that sapwood expand is doing all this.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Huh.
And the phloems, the sugars are made in the leaves, and the phloem are moving it all the way, down to the roots. But it also might move it up into an apple.
So would the best time to water a tree would be to water it at its base, maybe like an hour before the sun comes up or right before the sun comes up?
I think you could water any time during the night. That would be the best time. But you brought up a neat thing. The best time to measure the water status of a tree, we have an instrument that measures what's called the water potential. That's basically is the tree got a lot of water or not a lot of water. The best time to do that is right before dawn. And in fact, we call that pre-dawn water potential because that's the most hydrated the tree's going to get. Right before dawn.
What about the weight of a tree? So if you have a gigantic sequoia and let's say it rained at night, the weight of the tree in the, before the morning, would probably be substantially less than maybe midday, because by that time, a lot of water's come up into the tree, you know?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, you're right, spot on. In fact, tree trunks with fine instruments, they shrink and swell as well. And that's what you're saying. You would find a weight change, too, if you were able to somehow measure that in a live standing tree. But another applied study I'm doing right now with an undergraduate, we're cutting trees in the forest, but we're leaving the branches and leaves on. And that's called transpiration drying. And as the leaves are laying there on the ground, they're pulling water out of the tree. And she's seeing how much comes out, because one of the biggest costs in wood manufacturing is getting rid of the water. It takes a lot of energy to get rid of the water.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we let the leaves pull water out of the trunk and then come back and delimb the tree and bring the pole into the shop. But we're going to determine how much water actually comes out that way. And how long do the leaves actually keep transpiring when they're cut? Is this going to be worth it or not? Transpirational drying is not a new thing. People have been I'm reading this woodworking book, and there's a page in there about someone in Scandinavia talking about cutting trees and coming back 2 weeks later and then delimbing it, and they weigh much less. And it has a good hint for getting firewood because it weighs less. That's transpiration drying. They may not have called it that, but that's what it is. So yeah, they lose weight, and you can measure, they shrink and they swell. As during the day, they'd be shrinking. The trunk of the tree would kind of go in, and at night fill up and go out. And that's well known.
What about in a given forest at drier times of the year? Do the trees transpire more slowly? Is there a feedback mechanism where the stomata don't open as much or for as long because they know that it's dry and it'll release too much water?
Yeah, you're asking great questions. Yeah, they are absolutely, all plants, they're amazing organisms. As it starts getting dry, they close their stomata. Initially, it might be called midday. They're okay early in the morning, but then by 11 the sun's up higher, they'll close their stomata to save water. Now, when they do that, they're not making sugar. And then what you end up getting is a much smaller growth ring that year. And so that's why you can look at growth rings in trees and the patterns in that and see hey, this was a dry decade. This was a really, really moist decade. You have to account for a lot of other factors, but it absolutely shows up like that. So that's no different than your tomato plant. If it's a dry year, your tomatoes are little because they're not making sugar. But the plant's I'm going to stay alive, okay? And trees live a long, long time. And so they've got to be adapted to, let's like a white oak that lives 400 years in the eastern U.S., it's got to have mechanisms to survive any kind of environmental calamity that might occur over 400 years. We talk about a 50-year drought and a 100-year drought. They've got to be able to cope with that because you're going to get one. Probabilities say you're going to get one. And so, they have maybe 3 years of poor growth, but they're alive. And then 20 years later, they have 10 years of great growth. Yeah, but they live.
Are trees able to bank water like a camel or like a cactus?
Okay, some, you may have heard of a baobab tree.
Yeah, they're weird, yeah. Yeah, I can picture them, they're naked, but all the branches, they have a thin layer on top of hair.
They kind of look like they look like a gigantic jade plant. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they're in the movie. Rafiki, the monkey in The Lion King, lives in one of those trees. And they store a huge amount of water. Trees in the forests of the U.S., they all can store a little bit, but nothing like that or like a cactus, some cactus succulents can do. But a tree that they call that capacitance, like electrical capacitor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Even if they can delay, let's say that maybe they keep their stomata open 30 more minutes because their trunk hydrates at night more. That could add up to a lot of sugar that could make it more competitive versus its neighbor that can't do that. So it's not a major way that trees in the eastern forest, in like mesic and moist forests. It's not a major way they're dealing with drought, but it could give them an advantage over a neighbor that doesn't have the capacitance that it might have. So the short answer is yes, they can.
Well, yeah, I know we've gone way over time, but thank you so much for answering these questions. It's been a really interesting call.
No worries. No problem. You'll have more editing to do.
Yeah, no worries. If we could just restate again, where can people follow up and find out more?
They could do two things. They can Google Dr. Dendro, or they can Google the word dendrology, which is basically tree study. If you Google dendrology, Virginia Tech dendrology is right there after Wikipedia. We're at the top of the list.
Okay. Well, very good.
And there's lots and lots of stuff for people. A lot of free stuff there on tree identification and other things. It's the web. There's a whole web out there. I still go on there sometimes and find things like, I forgot that was there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the best thing is Google dendrology. And you can contact me with Dr. Dendro.
Well, excellent. Well, John, thank you so much. It's been a great call. I really appreciate you being here.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.